And I'm Isaac.
And we're here to talk about movies.
Indeed we are.
So this week, we decided to once again talk about horror movies, but mostly it started as just wanting to talk about 2019 horror movies, because there's been some interesting ones this year for sure that have really stood out to us.
Yeah, we weren't doing our podcast at the time when movies like Us and Midsummer came out, and then we were wanting to do an episode about Ready or Not because I think we have some interesting opinions on that one, but
Yeah,
we
indeed.
didn't get the time.
We wrote down some stuff, but then ultimately didn't do one. We decided to do the Stephen King adaptation one instead, I think, which also, because of timing, we didn't get to talk about It Chapter 2, so we
Although,
missed a lot there.
if you have not had a chance yet to check out our blog about movies, ci.wordpress.com, there is a post on there where I share my thoughts about It Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 sort of as a whole. Although we did not get to do a proper episode on It Chapter 2, you can find some thoughts of mine there if you were left unsatisfied after our Stephen King episode.
Yes, talking about It, even though the movie It Chapter 2 had already come out,
Yeah,
we didn't get to talk about it.
we were a bit outdated on that one.
Yeah.
But you can read more of my outdated thoughts on It Chapter 2 over on the blog. And for now, we will go ahead and talk about horror on broader terms than just Stephen King adaptations. Like Cory said, we're going to do all of 21st century horror, but then we figured it made more sense to narrow it to just the 2010s, since that's the decade that is on the verge of wrapping up. And this is the last Halloween season,
Right.
where you will get the chance to revisit the horror movies of the decade in such a
Right, while we're
in such
still
an
living in
appropriate
it, yeah.
season.
Also, particularly important for us, I think, this is the decade that we actually got to live through the horror movie experience, whereas when we were kids in the 2000s, we didn't watch a lot of horror movies.
Right.
I
And so
know I
looking
didn't-
back, I
yeah.
know at my history, my viewing history, which I keep pretty close track of on Letterboxd, I was very surprised at how big the disparity was between how many horror movies I've seen from the 2010s versus the 2000s, just adding to that point.
There's some good ones, for sure. There's Saw, everyone's favorite movie. 28 Days Later, which I have been telling Isaac he needs to see. Oh, also Let the Right One In, which
Yes.
we both wanted to top our 21st century list. But then we narrowed it to 2010s and had a different top of the list.
That one's 08, so unfortunately we're not going to dive into it in depth on this episode, but maybe in a future week. That is a phenomenal film, so anyone that has not seen Let the Right One In, add that to your
maybe we'll
Halloween viewing list.
maybe we'll watch Let Me In, the American adaptation, which is also relatively critically acclaimed.
And that's from
Do some
the
comparisons,
2010s,
and that is from the 2010s. Didn't include it on my list, but
We do have, nonetheless, plenty of interesting movies to discuss
yes.
that did come out in the 2010s.
So after extensive research, we have put together a definitive, essential list of 2010s.
You can
movies.
find the written form of the list on our blog. It'll be up along with this episode. We arranged it so we have one section that is the movies we both agreed are the essentials of 2010s horror, and then we have another section where our opinions differed a little bit, and so we have some textual sparring there.
Yeah, obviously we have not had the chance to see every horror movie released, so we can't say for certain which ones are the best, but we picked pretty closely what we thought would be essential viewing for the genre, right? A good summation, a good overview, boiled down into 20 films.
In terms of where the genre went over the
Right.
course of the
That's
2010s.
that's a good point, actually. It kind of has a nice chart overview starting early on and going into the later ones. In fact, do we even have any movies on there before 2013, 2014?
The Cabin in the Woods
Oh, yes,
is
2012, 2011.
right?
Yeah.
Aside from that, it is definitely weighted towards the middle to second half of the decade, but that is not an accident.
Right, not at all.
So
Yeah.
what happened to the genre in 2013, 2014, around that time?
So bringing Cabin in the Woods into it, which came out just before that time, it was kind of an anomaly in that the filmmakers and advertisements did a good job about not revealing anything in the film. So people came in and watched the first, 20 minutes or so thinking, wow, all these characters are like the stupidest, most ridiculous story that we've ever seen. It's just a classic like slasher, killing all the kids horror movies. And it became an anomaly because it does all the twists.
And honestly, you could maybe make the argument that it marks a kind of transition because it is ultimately so self-aware and satirical of all of the tropey slasher films, mostly, that rose to popularity as far back as the 80s, but saw this slog of remakes pop up in the 2000s, right? Now the 2010s, we had remakes of Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, some really big names that all came out over that course of that 10-year span.
And speaking of starting that in the 2000s with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, the prevalence for excessive gore, which somehow got really popular in movie theater sales. I'm thinking Saw and Hostel, but also just the overdone elements of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. And then later, the Rob Zombie Halloween remakes, which are affectionately described as Gornos.
I have not heard that term before.
It's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually seen one GIF at some point online comparing the shot from the original A Nightmare on Elm Street with the remade shot of the same scene, and it was, I believe it's the scene close to the end or even at the very end of the movie where he pulls her through a door.
Oh yeah,
right?
the very
the
end.
Hand comes out, grabs. I can't remember which character. It's been a while.
The mom
pulls her through a door, and then in the remake, his knife glove hands shoot through her head from behind, like her face is taking up the entire frame, and the knives come through her eyes. And it's just this horrendously, disgustingly gory scene that really is...
That's hilarious to me.
Anyway, that is a good example of how exhausted I think that whole genre of horror was as the 2000s transpired. And there were exceptions to the rule, of course, horror movies that did challenge conventions and buck expectations, like Let the Right One In, the Swedish horror film from 2008. But then there was still, I think, this sense of exhaustion with the genre, with the gore saturation of it, which Cabin in the Woods then came in and really critiqued heavily, pointed out a lot of the laughable flaws and tropes that had been inherent in horror for a long time at that point.
Yeah, the idea of basically running on autopilot with character archetypes and story plot lines that were so contrived that audiences just couldn't buy into it anymore. Following that, we get 2013, one of the first movies that I saw in theaters that was a horror movie, The Conjuring, which to me stands out as a defining moment that preceded the trend that created these critically and popularly acclaimed horror movies that did not use excessive gore or nudity or eye-catching things and basically just used straightforward, atmospheric, classic tropes of horror movies. The classics like the original Halloween and The Exorcist.
Right.
Things that establish a feeling of dread from the beginning and leave you on the edge of your seat the whole time, instead of periodic jump scares and characters and plot lines that you don't care about.
The Conjuring is a very old school movie in a lot of ways, I think, even though it is souped up and modern to scare viewers.
Yeah, I know it definitely got some negative criticism because it was produced and directed by James Wan, who made the Insidious and Saw franchises, and that itself became a spin-off franchise with the Annabelle series and the Conjuring sequels and many others that in total seem very ridiculous. But everything about the original Conjuring to me just strikes an instant classic. The tie-in of a real horror story, right? That kind of Amityville horror plot line that was taken with those real characters, the
Warrens.
Yeah, the Warrens, exactly. So all of those elements being brought into then a film that basically embodies this house as the enemy to the family this classic ghost story, no gore or really anything that would make it rated R other than just sheer terror.
Yeah, I
right?
remember actually when that movie carried out, there were maybe clickbaity news articles about how it didn't have any of the conventional content that would necessitate an R rating, but how the MPAA had given it the R rating supposedly because it was, quote, too scary for PG-13.
Yeah.
Right, so that put some butts in seats for sure, and it put my butt in the seat. It was also my first horror movie in theaters, and I had to actually engineer this whole situation where one of my parents bought me the ticket, escorted me into the theater with my cousin who was also not 17 yet, and then sat down with us but then left because they didn't want to see the movie. So I have a very fond memory of being curled up in my seat for the opening scene of The Conjuring when Annabelle is crashing at the door, just being absolutely raw with dread.
Everything that like goes through with the mom being possessed was just very well. I don't think I'd even seen The Exorcist at the time, so it struck me as so unusual for a horror movie when I'd only seen like really terrible ones at the time, like I don't know, Jeepers Creepers or stuff, the kind of monsterish horror movies that were like okay to see as kids because they were just like freaky weird monsters and not like a realistic situation.
Right, whereas I remember even from the beginning, the marketing for The Conjuring was something different. I remember the first trailer that came out, which was basically just that single scene where the mom wakes up in the middle of the night to the clapping and comes down into the cellar, and then the big sort of finish is the hands appear behind her and clap right next to her. And it just played that scene more or less start to finish, and then said The Conjuring and gave you no other information or context. Yeah. It's just very intriguing and restrained in a way
that's exactly what it is.
Horror from the previous decade very rarely was. And so I think that the commercial success of The Conjuring and the critical success of the first movie are both markers of this shift where mainstream horror fans reasserted their interest in that brand of smart, intentional horror that didn't rely on cheap jump scares and gross out tactics, like you said.
Yeah. So where I primarily identified The Conjuring as a movie that I would have put on this list of best 2010s movies, one that we especially both agree on is absolute essential viewing came right after that in 2014, and that was The Babadook, which found unusually high popular success as well as insane critical success.
Yeah.
For pretty much all those same reasons we talked about.
Right. More of an indie hit, right? This didn't have the mainstream horror appeal of The Conjuring, and it's easy to see why when you watch The Babadook, because it's actually a pretty slow movie that unfolds as a character drama and psychological thriller for more of its runtime than it does as an overt horror movie. But the horror in its DNA definitely shines through.
I agree that it was an indie success technically, but I feel that it broke out of that much more than it should have. And one of those reasons is because audiences were starting to respond really well to that old school horror approach instead of the excess.
However, I do think that what separates The Babadook for me from something like The Conjuring is that while The Conjuring was very effective at rekindling the old school horror method of the slow building dread and the non-reliance on jump scares and the haunted house setup, etc., The Babadook is where we really start to see something new being brought to the table in the genre in the 2010s. Fair. What I'm thinking of in particular as far as what that film brought to the genre was utilizing this very visceral horror, in this case the looming figure of the demonic Babadook, as a representation or means of exploring the mental illness of its central character.
And dealing with the child who, in short, is a problem child.
Right. And I think ultimately the Babadook itself is more of a representation of the main character Amelia's grief and depression than it is a literal monster in the closet, right?
Yeah, I think the key word is looming that you said, because it's not like it's a monster right in full view directly terrorizing us. You know, it's no Godzilla or even like a ghost that it's something you can really understand that's terrorizing you just from folk tales and things like that. It's a very original entity that is never seen fully, plaguing the mind of its main character, right? Infecting it like a mental illness instead of like a traditional possession or poltergeist type situation.
Right. And we see this trend popping up multiple times throughout the decade, where you can point to the central malevolent figure in the horror film as being some sort of allegory for the mental traumas of the main character or characters. I'm thinking It Follows, The Witch.
Yeah, kind of a social critique in itself, yeah.
The monsters in these movies can be pointed to as more clear allegories or representations of the struggles that the characters are undergoing, as opposed to literal monsters in the closet.
Yeah, I was just going to say about The Witch that I see that as kind of using the place of women in a traditional family setting to take a witchy devil story and turn it into something that is from a bygone era that we couldn't possibly really understand or follow, into something that seems oddly relevant and terrifying and fairly realistic until the full-on witch stuff starts happening. It seems like any kind of fault or failing at the hands of a young woman is just automatically assumed to be a witch, right? Any kind of outside thinking from this traditional archetype, this traditional family setting, becomes the enemy of the family, right? It's then seen as she is plaguing the family's structure and ability to survive.
Before we continue on, though, to talking in depth about these other movies, I want to establish a couple things. The first is that I think it's important that we clarify that horror films exploring the anxieties of a particular time period is nothing new. We definitely need to establish that that's something that the genre has very much done from the outset. And in fact, that's maybe the root of horror movies is using these fantastical, in some cases, horrors to explore very real human issues, whether they be social or psychological in nature. You can point back to something like The Exorcist as being a movie about rebellion, adolescence coming just after the whole tumultuous youth counterculture revolution of the 1960s, where there was this whole outcry over the changing mores and values of the youth. And that's just one example. You could definitely point to many, many others. So I don't mean to say that The Babadook and these other movies tackling mental issues or social issues with their, quote, monsters is a new idea in and of itself, but they feature that aspect, I think, more prominently, you could argue, than a lot of the films that came before them. They're just more preoccupied with exploring that side of things, and they tie in this slow build dread, the non-cheap kind of horror, with very relevant and grounded character and societal explorations that don't feel ham-fisted and that aren't even really subtext. It's like the text is the characters grappling with these things, right? It's not just like a vague allegory. It's a very real struggle with depression in the case of The Babadook, or a struggle with isolation and paranoia in the case of The Witch.
Yeah.
The one other thing I wanted to say before we move on is that I think that we also should be careful not to just point to all these movies and try to assert that they all are new and great and contributing to this horror renaissance for the same reason. They don't all do the exact same thing, and they don't all have the same goal or the same structure or anything like that.
At the same time, you did point out a thread that I had not seen fully before, the originality of a few of the films, right? Especially The Babadook and It Follows, kind of using an original setting as opposed to The Witch and The Conjuring using settings that we're very familiar with in a horror movie.
So maybe we can formally move the conversation on to what comes after the Babadook, which is It Follows.
Yeah.
Coming just a matter of months after the Babadook in the same year.
Mm-hmm.
And forming the foundational duo of the modern horror renaissance.
Both of these movies were not giant popular successes, although they were more popular than they probably should have been, because they both feel like they're from a long bygone era. You know what I mean? Especially It Follows, with the kind of out of time feeling. Everything feels old in the movie.
Yeah, there's
and
a
yet
synthy 80s score.
Yeah, and they're watching like black and white movies and stuff like that. And even in the Babadook, even though that's set in Australia, so I'm not sure exactly what Australia looks like in modern times, but even that one feels less modern and up to date and more a classic single mother and daughter, or single mother and son, struggling through life.
Yeah, so there are definitely old school elements of both of these movies. The slow pace and the method of scaring audiences that we already talked about.
And It Follows, I think, is one of the more successful of the films that we have chosen, because it uses a classic horror movie idea of like sex in horror movies and puts a very interesting twist on it, right? Because there's the classic idea that like in Friday the 13th and things like that, and even Halloween, scenes where these kids are having sex and then they die, right? It's the transgression of the young people that are deserving to be killed for what they've done, kind of.
Right.
That very heavily thrown down your throat idea that you've probably heard in any film, like old film analysis.
Right. But then what It Follows does is, instead of just using sex as a marker of the people who deserve to die, it ties sex with the narrative and with the monstrous threat in an extremely important way, right? Sex like drives the entire narrative, and instead of brushing off the people that have sex and killing them off, as would be typical in a lot of the slasher films that dominated for a long time in the genre, sex becomes a very important marker, and the characters that have sex actually instantly become like more vital to the narrative because they've had sex. It's a very interesting spin.
It's an interesting twist.
Service level, very simple premise that almost feels like it might be gimmicky, but it ends up not feeling that way at all.
Yeah, I think the concept of like an STD ghost threw some people off. A lot of people that I talked to thought that it was a cheap gimmick, but I never felt that way about it. I always thought it was an original twist, because I don't think it's as much about STDs, even though that, I mean, I can see the comparison, right? Passing it on one person to the next. I think it's more about the anxiety of youthful sex, the pressure and feeling that you get, especially I imagine as a woman, dealing with that whole situation where on some sides of it, the society is telling you you're not supposed to because you have to stay pure and whatever, old-fashioned thinking, but also the pressure of modern society saying you don't want to be a prude, you want to be, I don't know, an open human being who can do whatever they want. And, of course, the initial anxiety when you're a young person in love. The first person that the girl is dating in the movie who gives her the curse, the ghost, it seems like a very normal situation. And then the turn after they have sex, everything becomes clear, right? What's going to happen in the story. It's like he turned everything back onto her all of a sudden, and everything that sex entailed in the story, it's the ghost, but in real life, that could have just been some kind of guilt, some kind of internal feeling about now knowing that you're not a virgin. There's a lot of ways you can think about this, and ways that you can think about it not even relating to sex, right? The idea of knowing that you can pass this on and not have to bear the burden anymore, but then having to bear the burden of giving it to someone else and damning them for the rest of their life.
This gets very much at the idea that these are loaded movies.
Mhm.
They have a lot to chew on, and very importantly, they don't feel like they're shoving these ideas down your throat. They are engaging horror films that are genuinely scary and entertaining just as movies that you watch, right? They're not
Right.
like esoteric art house movies. They are good horror movies, and they have that meat to chew on that
Yeah.
the genre was missing for a long, long time.
And it's like you said, it's not like these ideas are just plainly said so that they're, forced down your throat. It's all of this important underlying idea that's coming from a well-crafted film.
Mm-hmm. It's a story that is being told above all else. That story happens to be a horror story.
Yeah,
It's-
that I think brings it back to the Babadook. There's a story in there that doesn't have anything to do with a monster entity terrorizing Essie Davis, whatever her character's name is. There's a mother dealing with her son, feeling grief and depression, feeling pressure of society as a single mother, trying to deal with a difficult child. There's a lot in there that is heart-wrenching and speaks to you emotionally besides the horror elements.
Definitely.
And that weight adds on to the feeling that you get when you watch the films.
So I want to make sure we mention, before we get too far into this thing, that very importantly, it follows the Babadook and the Witch, which we've already talked about some, even though the Witch actually came a year after those two.
Mm-hmm.
All three of those movies were directed by directors who had really nothing of note on their resumes.
Yeah, Robert Eggers, right, directorial debut.
On the Witch.
Jennifer Kent, directorial debut on the Babadook. I don't know about David
I think
Robert
David
Mitchell.
Robert Mitchell had directed one movie before It Follows, but
Yeah.
it was pretty under the radar, and it released in 2010, the only other feature film that he did. So he's still of the 2010s.
Right. All of these directors are not Wes Craven level, old school guys that
Or
are
even James Wan level.
Or even James Wan. That's true. Even James Wan level. The Conjuring is probably not at the same caliber as these other movies in terms of essentially defining these new ideas that we're teasing out. It's all directors who are directing exclusively in the 2010s,
Mhm.
right? Fresh new faces that are somehow bringing these brand new ideas. It makes perfect sense when you think about it, but at the same time, that's not usually how movie popularity works nowadays, it seems like, right? We're so awash in sequels and franchises that it's easy to sometimes forget that there's all these great movies that are defining new elements in film, using classic elements, teasing out a few new ideas, and all coming from fresh new directors.
Mm-hmm. New blood, and it shows.
Yes.
In other words.
And from, not just from the US, we talked about Jennifer Kent, Australian. And there's other ones too, like we want to mention Train to Busan, which came out in 2016. That is also from the live action debut, I believe, of the director, who is South Korean. His name is Yeon Sang-ho. He had directed animated movies before, but I believe that was his first
His live action.
live action. So another first.
Mm-hmm. That is a movie out of South Korea, which we could have another episode, I think, dedicated probably entirely to the Korean horror renaissance that is taking place kind of in parallel to this whole renaissance of modern horror. But actually, I think you could trace its origins a little bit further back even.
Yeah, definitely.
As a topic for another day. I think maybe, though, after we have just touched upon those new auteurs and that whole idea that they were driving this renaissance with their new ideas, maybe we can jump forward a couple of years to, I think, what a lot of people would consider the ultimate new horror auteur, Jordan Peele.
Probably marked the greatest blend of critical and popular success of all of the ones we've talked about so far.
Let's Get Out, 2017.
Written and directed by Jordan Peele. Directorial debut, I believe.
It was.
For both of us, our number one essential 2010s horror movie.
Yeah. I think that Get Out is perhaps the most underrated movie ever to get 99% on Rotten Tomatoes. Not underrated because it got bad reviews, but underrated because I don't think you possibly can overrate this movie.
Yeah.
It is just a brilliant, brilliant film, start to finish. It's crafted with such intentionality.
One thing that we've kind of brought up in all these movies is that there's not just one element that's cool about them, right? There's multiple elements in all of these horror movies that make them unique and interesting. In Get Out, literally everything in the film is well made and very interesting.
Mm-hmm. We've got our protagonist, Chris, who is played memorably by Daniel Kaluuya, who up to this point a lot of people just knew as the guy from that one Black Mirror episode, but then
Yeah.
he's now, I think, mostly associated with Get Out because of how incredibly memorable his performance is. He is asked to carry a lot of scenes in the film, and he does so with success that I think is very well characterized by how iconic that image of his face has become, with the tears coming out of his eyes during the first sunken place scene.
And yeah, in addition, the three mains of the family that he's going to meet, Allison Williams, Catherine Keener, and Bradley Whitford.
The Armitages.
Yeah, the Armitages. You know, not just bland, faceless people. They all have their own interesting character points and all fascinatingly turn at the right point in the movie to become sinister and evil. Whereas, you know, the first meeting seems very pleasant and natural, albeit with some suspicion already from Chris.
Yeah, it's this classic setup where we at first enter this idyllic, welcoming house, and then its horrors are slowly unveiled, and like you said, the creeping suspicion that something's not right is planted from the outset by the fact that it's called Get Out, and also just several other red flags that pop up.
Yeah, the opening scene, which I think you could write a whole essay about.
This is a movie that makes for incredibly rich subsequent viewings, where there's these details that you don't notice the first time around, like the deer that Chris hits on the way to the Armitage house that ends up being this evocative symbol of his grief for his mother. There are a lot of hindsight 2020 moments with Allison Williams'
it's
character.
Also, it's like the classic bad omen start to a film, right? It's not like this is a fully brand new, like every single idea is a brand new film. It's just that it uses every one of those old ideas and new concepts in perfect harmony. You're not viewing the movie and seeing, oh, this is all this old stuff that I've seen before. It's mostly that they're all tying it together in brand new, unique, interesting ways.
And that makes both for an incredibly entertaining movie. Like, I remember my theater experience watching Get Out was just one of the most sublimely enjoyable theater experiences I've ever had. The audience is so engaged. Every big scare and laugh is just met with this big roaring response because of how classically enjoyable this movie is. But then also, it is very rich with social commentary and
I think one of the first
messaging.
to explicitly use racial tension as a horror element. There's definitely some older ones that you might be able to pinpoint, but not explicitly, right?
And not modern, not up
and
to
not
date.
modern, exactly.
Yeah, this one tackles issues of implicit racism and microaggressions and underlying festering resentment or
right, the things that no one
that
talks about but everyone knows in terms of racism. Yeah,
it's a very modern take on a racial horror film.
The sense that you're seeing a classic in real time. You know, it's the horror auteur first directorial debut, written and directed by the same person. Everything's just fresh. Seeing that in our own time is very cool.
It is. Yeah, it feels so vital and full of life despite the amount of death that is in the movie. You have a sense that this is a labor of love, and I think you get that sense with a lot of modern horror films, but very few of them achieve that intersection of just sheer entertainment and enjoyability as a movie crossed with the amount of material to ponder that Get Out provides you with. That, you know, those two elements I think are present in a lot of the movies that mark this modern horror renaissance, and Get Out just marks, I think, their apex in terms of the execution.
Agreed. I also saw Us in theaters, but question the exact feeling that I got, because a lot of reviews and lists that I've seen place Us ahead of Get Out, which I would definitely not agree with.
I don't buy that.
Honestly, I'm just not sure why. So I want to hear your take on it first.
So my take is that Get Out is Jordan Peele running out of the gate with this very clear concept for this movie and showing the whole world how intentionally and effectively he can craft this like lean, mean horror dark comedy experience. And then Us is Jordan Peele saying, okay, now I've shown you what I'm capable of, so I'm going to throw a whole lot more at you now in a much less organized way and just let you chew on it and think about it and experience it as you will. He's sort of already been accepted as this brilliant auteur, and so there's more of this sense that people think of his contribution as being inherently valuable because it's from him. It's not nearly as concise as Get Out. It's much more nebulous in terms of the narrative is more convoluted, and the themes are not nearly as readily apparent. Everything about this movie is less accessible and digestible than Get Out.
But you still think it's essential for our decade.
Yeah, I still loved it. I don't think it's as good as Get Out. I think that it is, if Get Out is like almost as close to perfect as a movie can get, then Us is messy and flawed, definitely, by comparison. But the sense that you're watching something with enormous vitality and purpose behind it remains. The highs are just as high as the highs in Get Out.
There are some good scenes for sure.
There's the climactic dance fight scene intercut at the end with the I've Got 5 on It remix, brilliantly punctuating the blows. It's like a really stunning stylistic exercise.
Yeah, the initial scene where we see that there's more of the underground people than just the initial family, where it cuts to the other family for a few minutes just talking.
Totally blows your mind.
Yeah, and then they just immediately get killed. Yeah, Tim Heidecker.
Tim Heidecker's family.
Yeah.
Definitely some very memorable scenes. Also, the whole initial home invasion sequence that is divulged partially in the trailers is a real marvel, I think, to watch play out in its full glory. But then I think going along with that, there's definitely some perplexing elements of Us. I know at the very beginning of the movie, there's what feels like 3 different opening scenes that just sort of...
The rabbit scene, yeah.
There's the rabbits, there's the amusement park, and then there's also the scene with her watching TV where we get our first hints at the whole underlying like human fence theme because she sees a TV ad for it.
Yeah.
So there's this sense that Jordan Peele is kind of piling on all of the toppings in this
and
one.
Also, what is the human chain link thing? Like, is that supposed to be a fence? What is the meaning of that?
I don't know.
I slightly question a movie that even after watching it and reading the like direct commentary of Jordan Peele's explanation and still not really understanding what he's trying to say, I wonder if that does have the same emotional weight, that it's just something so complex that you can only tease out slight ideas of it, or there's just not enough grounded material to latch onto.
Well, so I think that where I would differ is that I do agree that there are elements of Us that are overstuffed and unnecessary. I think there is enough grounded material still present to make for a compelling viewing experience that feels like it has something concrete to say.
I agree that it feels like it has something concrete to say, but I don't know if it does. I don't know if I really still got anything about the social critique that was trying to be brought out there, right? You can tell that there is one and that there is a commentary on American society, but I don't know what it is.
Right. Well,
that sounds, I don't know.
No, I mean, I see what you mean, and I can't point to the 3 specific themes that Us is focused on in the same way I can for Get Out. I can say that there's certainly some class commentary going on there with the underground sewer people that, you know, come up and try to replace all of the above ground people who have written them off and forgotten about them. There is some family dynamics commentary going on with the way that the traditionally masculine dad is this almost like comic relief buffoon, and then the whole central duality of Lupita Nyong'o's character is, I think it's really where the film finds its center. Her character's personal struggle with the past trauma of the opening scene in the amusement park and identity crisis.
What is the past trauma, right? To spoil the twist ending, it ends up that they actually switch places,
right,
and the underground version of her, the child, lived the above ground life, and that was why initially she seemed so traumatized, because she just couldn't talk because nobody had an actual voice in the underground world. That same upper version of her ended up leading a revolution. It's a cool idea, and I liked it when I saw it. But,
it's like a giant Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, but the enigmatic quality of it is so out there. It seemed to me that it was just throwing all these interesting ideas together, but not quite putting them together well enough to reach the quality that I would say the other movies that we've talked about would reach. And that was my problem too with Ready or Not. It poses all of these cool ideas and is a very entertaining film, but doesn't really say anything very concrete about the topic, and just brings up those questions without tying them together.
I don't think I agree that a movie needs to answer the questions that it raises, or like
I don't think it needs to answer them. I'm just saying it needs to have some kind of purposeful leaving them open, because both the ending of Us and the ending of Ready or Not have a sort of resolution, but they're not clear on what that resolution is.
Okay.
And definitely, right, Us is more open-ended, and it might make for a sequel one day. Hopefully not, but it honestly is that open-ended.
But we already have that movie.
Yeah. The fact that it's at a midpoint, right? It's not going one way or the other. It's not fully tying them up and answering the questions, but it's not leaving them posed for you to really chew on enough at the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, for the sake of time, let's talk about Ready or Not.
Okay.
It's interesting that you've related these two movies because they are
very different.
Very different, and Ready or Not it has more Get Out in its DNA than it has Us in its DNA.
Right.
In terms of
it's
its
almost
structure, and it also has some narrative similarities. But I saw Ready or Not as having some very clear things to say about the way that the Ladomas family handles the perpetuation of their wealth and status, right? The whole central conceit of the movie is that they have this like culling process for new people who are going to enter the family that will possibly end up resulting in their death if they're like unworthy. And also there's an element of like random chance to it, which I think is a really interesting sly winking eye in terms of just like how the accumulation of wealth happens and how a lot of it is just random chance in terms of like who gets to join these elite circles and who doesn't. I view the end of Ready or Not, which you brought up, as not tying things up in a way that felt satisfying or leading a clear example for like discussion of the movie's themes, in actually a pretty different way. Or at least I think that there is a way that you can view the ending in a meaningful way. So what happens at the end, to totally spoil Ready or Not, brace yourself if you haven't seen it, after this entire ordeal has transpired, we are finally led into the fact that the Ladomas family have actually signed a literal pact with Satan, where the deal is that they will be able to stay alive as long as they continue performing this crazy tradition.
Right, and that also ties into their status, right? They get all this good fortune as well in their lives and have become rich, all relating to this central satanic pact.
Yeah, this original benefactor whose contribution to the family's wealth was tied to a pact with Satan. So then, at the very end, the pact with Satan is broken because our main protagonist stays alive for the whole night, and all of the nefarious family members explode in fountains of blood and gore. It is this affirmation that it wasn't just paranoia or insane superstition or unnecessary violence being carried out by the upper class family. It was actually necessary for their own survival that they were doing what they were doing. But also, the ending is the only explicitly fantastical part of the entire movie, right? When they all explode, that's the only time we ever see anything not technically possible within the realm of our reality happen on screen in the movie. You could potentially read that as the first hour and 25 minutes of the movie, it's pretty short, as being a depiction of like how the world really works and how the class system functions in reality. And then the last 5 minutes where we see all the rich assholes explode in fountains of blood is this revolution fantasy almost, where the moral code is upheld in the end by an impossible supernatural pact, right? It's like a deus ex machina almost that ends up getting her out of the situation. Whereas everything else that we had seen in the movie, it seemed totally hopeless for her, right? Her resilience as a human carries her through to that point in the movie, but then there's nowhere else left for her to go. Her husband has just turned on her. She now is stuck in a room with all of these people who have weapons.
I totally
right?
get her side of the story, right? It's pure survival instinct, and the arc of, oh, I'm going to be a nice wife for this rich family, turning into basically a animalistic, survivalist who will do anything, kill anyone to survive. That was very cool to see that transition. I just still wonder about the Ladomus family's role in the movie. Are they justified because it turned out that they were also in the same survival situation and basically stuck in it? They're in the same situation where if they don't do something by the end of the night, they will die. I almost wonder if that insane superstition and paranoia could have been kept more realistic. I almost wanted to see the ending. Like, it was shocking, and it worked well for shock value in terms of, right, the entertainment. But that's all that I could see it as. I couldn't see that as a grounded break in reality, right? Enough rooted in the real world. It just felt like all of a sudden something completely different was happening. And while that was shocking...
Isn't that the definition of break in reality, though? Like, to have that total, 90
But I feel like
turn.
there's other instances in movies where it's like realistic characters dealing with supernatural situations, and that just took me out of it for some reason. It was so outlandish and so off with what the movie was saying the whole time that it made me confused about what they were doing, right? It wasn't that a moral code was resolved at the end, it was that a supernatural entity was either wanting one person killed, every time somebody comes into the family that it didn't like or something, or letting everyone be killed.
Well, and so it's like totally arbitrary and absolutely ridiculous at the
right.
end.
In that
it
sense,
doesn't really
that,
make any sense.
Yeah.
But I still think that that's what ends up getting her out of it in the end, right? Like, without the presence of that totally arbitrary supernatural entity, she would have been totally screwed, and the family would have probably been able to carry on doing what they were doing. The whole social structure would never have been disrupted. So, like, if you take that ending out of the equation, then there's no disruption of social order, and things just carry on like they do in real life without that disruption happening. It almost becomes a comment in its own right. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, and maybe we're both reading too much into it. I don't know. Screw it. I love, injecting my thoughts and philosophies into the movies that I watch, because what else am I going to do with my time? You can view that as the only way out for her is this preposterous explosion of all of the people that are threatening her. It is totally jarring and doesn't make any sense. And it's the only thing that results in there being a happy ending in the movie, which that feels significant in and of itself for me, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like, I see what you mean, and I think that it not working for you is like, okay, fair enough.
Probably
but
personal,
it worked for me. Or at least initially I was definitely like, what? Like, it's not what I thought was going to happen. I thought they were going to be superstitious. And then But then because I had that expectation so ingrained because of the tone that the movie struck in terms of how it viewed the entrenchment of that elite class of people, extra attention was drawn to the end of that movie because it is the only thing that disrupts that ingrained social order, basically. And it does so in such an explosive and distracting way, is what I'm saying.
I can see that, and I can buy that part as social critique for sure. Last two things, because we probably should move on, but agree with what you're saying there, and that was just not how I was reading it, so that is interesting. I disagree with saying it was a moral code being upheld, and also that things that don't make sense can be viable social critiques, because I feel like there is an element that an unfair world, it makes sense that things should be fair, but that's not how it is. So there's an element of sense in there, and there's an element that doesn't make sense.
Well, you have to view what happens at the end as being completely ridiculous in order for it to work. You have to write off the ending as being like a pipe dream, basically, in order to read it the way I'm reading it.
Yeah, no, and I can see that.
With that...
Yeah, we got a lot of good 2019 horror in there, so I think that was a satisfying conclusion for that.
Yeah, that was a good little Ready or Not spar session.
Yeah.
And I am really curious if anyone comes down one way or the other on this issue of whether Ready or Not works as social critique. We want to talk about Midsommar and Hereditary, Ari Aster's horror
films
duo, right, from 2018 and 2019. But I've got to go to work.
Yeah. So we'll be done and say that Ready or Not is unquestionably good entertainment. So where you can go from that is based on your personal understandings of film and the universe, maybe. But yeah, that's the beauty of art, that it can be interpreted in many different ways. And I am comfortable saying that Ready or Not is beyond schlock and is art in itself. So yeah,
well, I appreciate that. That's the only acknowledgement that I demand.
Cool.
Of the situation. Also, you have to say that you're wrong and I'm right.
Okay.
On the mic.
No,
make
but,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm kidding.
I know. Look out for more content soon, because we want to continue talking about horror movies, because an hour is not sufficient time. So
it really isn't for what has become one of my favorite genres.
Yeah.
But I think that this was a good October primer dissection of 2010's horror.
Yeah, so check out the blog soon for this list and our little thoughts on each movie. Yeah, check that out. And you can read my scathing thoughts on Ready or Not there.
And my scathing thoughts on
A Quiet Place.
Quiet Place, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll be done for now, but thanks for listening. Hit us up, social media.
About Movies CI, everybody. And in the meantime, before our next episode, get your spook on. It's time to start watching horror movies. So if you haven't seen any of the ones that we talked about,
all worth watching. All of these are worth watching for sure.
And if you have any under the radar recommendations, hit us up as well. I'm always looking for some good October viewing.
As long as you are not one of those people that thought the Annabelle movies were good, then I think we'll be okay.
You know who I think liked the latest Annabelle movie is my Inlander editor dude. And he's pretty discerning, and I was pretty shocked.
Inlander editor dude, what are you doing, man?
I won't drop his name here, but I don't think he'll listen to this.
Probably.
If you do, pop on. We'll have you as a guest, and we can talk about Annabelle.
Has any third movie in a series ever been good?
Star Wars Revenge of the Sith?
That's the sixth, technically.
I mean, Toy Story 3. There's some exceptions. Right? We could probably have an episode on the few great threequels, but that's not.
Oh, The Matrix. Yeah, that one was pretty.
Oh, Matrix Revolutions, right? No, I don't. Annabelle Comes Home is not one of them.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how bad it is.
It's bad.
Okay, we'll watch it later.
Sometimes though, October makes for a good time to watch some bad horror movies as well as good ones. And
hey, we're gonna watch VHS, so
we're gonna watch VHS. Yeah.
I don't know if it's good or bad, but
and if you haven't seen Hereditary and Midsommar, even though we didn't talk about them here, that's a fun. Fun Halloween viewing, family Halloween films.
Yeah, don't let your kids walk in when some horrible stuff. We won't say anything on this one, but yeah, horrible stuff.
Or do if you want to get them ready for how brutal the real world is. Just plop down your toddler in front of Hereditary. and tape their eyes open.
Oh, God. That's horrifying.
All right. Well, on that note,
Goodbye.
thank you for listening, everyone. We will see you next time.
All right. Have a good one. Bye.
Boo!